There's a great quote by Antonio Gramsci, which is often cited, in which he writes, "The old is dying and the new cannot yet be born. Amidst this interregnum, a whole host of morbid symptoms appears." And that's essentially Slavoj Žižek's argument in his book Against Progress, a short collection of essays that was recently published by Bloomsbury Press. And he essentially casts a critical, a polemical and philosophical gaze upon what you might call the signs or symptoms of decline, the decline of the neoliberal Western social and moral political order. And I should note very briefly that, and perhaps this should go without saying, that Žižek is alarmed at what is happening, which is to say Žižek is both a well-known critic of this liberal order, in as much as he is a critic of the emerging, what he calls soft fascism, of neo-nationalist right-wing politics. And Žižek essentially makes the argument here that the best way to define progress is by rejecting the idea that progress is inherent. He's completely against the idea that progress is a kind of linear development towards a common good, towards justice, as it were. Instead, Žižek says that we have to completely rethink and problematize the very idea of progress itself. We have to subject it to a kind of Socratic inquiry in which we ask ourselves, what exactly is it that we mean by the idea of progress? And Žižek says that one of perhaps the most useful definitions of ethical progress is to define it in negative terms. He says, one way of defining such progress is to say that something that used to be acceptable now seems impossible. For example, the widespread use of rape and torture, slavery. These used to be accepted by most people as simply how the world is, and yet in today's modern era, it seems completely unacceptable. Žižek argues that this is one sign of progress, which you might call negative ethical progress, that something that used to be commonplace now seems like a taboo. Of course, against this, he argues, we're facing a regression in which suddenly these things are up for debate once again. And so we're actually declining in ethical terms because what used to be a decided issue is now suddenly something that we have to re-litigate. We are regressing. And Žižek actually starts this book with a really interesting example or an illustration from Christopher Nolan's film, The Prestige. It's an example that he's used before, but I think here it works really well. One of the early scenes in The Prestige features a magician who performs a trick where a bird is made to disappear. Essentially, it is squashed, it is killed, and then it is brought back to life. And in this scene, we see a young boy who is distraught that the bird has been killed. And he doesn't really believe that this new bird is the same bird. And the magician says, of course, it died and I brought it back to life. And yet we see after the scene is over, the dead bird being removed in the background. In other words, one bird had to be killed in order for the other bird to be brought back to life. And Žižek says that one of the elementary gestures of ideological critique is always to go looking for these dead birds. In other words, to ask what had to be killed, what had to be sacrificed in order for the idea of progress and resurrection to take place. In other words, he basically makes one of the classic Marxist arguments, which is that any form of progress is always another version of regression in disguise. As Walter Benjamin famously put it, civilization is but another form of barbarism. And Žižek says that he believes that progress is possible, but it is only possible if we begin by redefining the terms of what progress is. He argues against a universal global idea of progress, and instead says that we should have a localized version of incremental progress. Progress by which we become aware of localized battles for emancipation and solidarity. And Žižek says that here, and in this sense, he identifies as what he calls a conservative communist. And what is a conservative communist? Because this is a confusing thing to say. Well, he basically defines it as someone who believes that in the face of crises, including both global ecological catastrophe, as well as impending social and geopolitical crises, that the only way to overcome them is by means of global solidarity movements. That what we're facing right now is an acceleration of these crises, essentially a fetishistic disavowal of them. But if we want to overcome them, our hand will be forced. We will be forced to act. And in this sense, Žižek says that he is a strategic pessimist, which is to say that he doesn't believe that things are necessarily going to become better by themselves, but he does believe that when the moment of crisis comes and we are forced to act, that we can, in fact, save ourselves. In this sense, he says he remains hopeful precisely because he is a pessimist. And Žižek says that when it comes to the idea of progress, we actually also have to look at the morbid symptoms, as I began this video with, the signs of decline. And he says, as many other critics have been arguing for many years, decades even, that the contradictions implicit within the neoliberal capitalist project, which to say the Faustian pact by which liberal virtue signaling was culturally enshrined within a democratic politics that nevertheless simply served to protect the interests of corporations, that this contradiction was always going to lead to a neo-fascist, what he calls soft fascist resurgence. And that this resurgence represents a pseudo-revolution, which is to say it wants to go back, it wants to make America great again, it wants to undo all that which has been done. And yet this pseudo-revolution is precisely a dead end for Žižek. We cannot return. He says, in this sense, liberals are actually similar to MAGA voters. Liberals want to turn back time and go back to the 1990s or early 2000s in which globalization was still heralded as this fundamental good. And he says we have to resist this idea that the only way to go forward is by means of going back. Instead, we must go through. And what we are seeing now, therefore, isn't a genuine form of progress inasmuch as it isn't a genuine form of regression. Instead, it is a Gramscian morbid symptom. The culturalization of politics, as Walter Benjamin put it, is the result of the politicization of culture. And this means that this era that we're going through right now is perhaps not one that can be suitably criticized in traditional, dogmatic, old-school left-wing terms. Žižek says, building upon the recent work of Yanis Varoufakis, that perhaps talking about capitalism is no longer enough. Perhaps we have to call it techno-feudalism. And vice versa, perhaps the left and progressive liberal left has to let go of the defense of the welfare state and all the ideals of the post-war liberal order. Žižek says that, in a sense, we have to be more European than the Europeans. We have to be more progressive than the progressive. We have to be more communist than the communists. He says that to be a left-wing critic and activist today means to constantly begin anew. In this sense, he argues that we must make a new beginning. We must sever ourselves from the past. We must stop defending that which we never fully believed in, which was the liberal order, including its virtue signaling and its fragile alliance with corporate greed. And instead, we must posit ourselves amidst this new future of radical social and cultural regression, of morbid symptoms, and of an uncertain future. In other words, if the new cannot yet be born, then the only way to make it come is to rethink the very idea of progress, the very idea of the future. And that is what Slavoj Žižek has tried to do in his book, Against Progress. Now, there's more to talk about here, so please do join me in my Patreon-only bonus Discord session where I answer your questions and continue the discussion. I would also like to say thank you for everybody watching today. My goal with this channel has been to make learning about philosophy and theory easy and accessible for anyone. And if you'd like to support my work, and if you'd like to be a part of our global learning community, please do consider becoming a patron. Thank you so much, and I will see you soon.